up, y'all? We're back in the shop here at Builtwell. Today we're going to talk about what to do if you've just bought a used Dyna or if your current Dyna has been neglected and hasn't been serviced in a while. We got our buddy BF Josh's 2000 Dyna here. He's been deployed for 8 months. He'll be back in a few weeks, so this is a perfect example of a bike to use that has been sitting for a while, or a used bike that you're unfamiliar with. Modern bikes run so well that a lot of guys forget to do their maintenance or just neglect it because the bike is running great. If you bought a used bike, you don't know what the previous owner has done or hasn't done. Even if the bike runs tits, there might still be something that needs to be addressed in there. The way I like to work on bikes that I'm unfamiliar with, that I need to just go over the whole thing, is work front to back. We're gonna check wear items, bolts, fluids, cables, levers, everything on this bike. First thing we're talking about is tires. This information applies to the front and the rear tire. It's identical. First thing I like to do is rub my hand on the treads of the tires, and what I'm looking for is uneven surface, meaning the treads, one higher, one lower, and right here you can feel an uneven surface, and that's known as cupping. Normally this is due to improper PSI. There might be a few other factors, but this is something that is going to be needed to be addressed sooner rather than later. This tire is still good, it still has some life on it, but just know that when you start cupping, it's going to be time for some new tires soon. Another thing to check out on the tires is tread depth. You want to make sure that there's ample depth in these treads to siphon water properly. If your tire's bald and it's not designed to be bald, you need a new tire. This tire right here is a perfect example of a tire with no more tread. Obviously it's bald, you can see where tread used to be. If you're running your tire like this, it is way overdue. One other thing to look for is weather cracking. You can see here these cracks in this sidewall. These cracks can happen anywhere on the tire, and that's caused from dry rot, from just old rubber sitting out in the sun, UV exposure. If you've got these anywhere on your tires, even if the tires are fairly new, you need to replace them ASAP. The last thing I like to check when it comes to the tires is the PSI. This is one of the most overlooked things when it comes to tires. Take a good gauge, check it, make sure it's within spec according to what you like or what your service manual calls for. And another thing to remember is always check your PSI cold, because once the bike is rolling and generates heat, it changes the PSI and it will give you a false reading. The next thing we're going to talk about is fork seals. Now you may notice this is an inverted front end and not a typical Harley front end. That's okay. All front ends have fork seals in them. What you need to look for is oil and grime escaping from your fork seals running down. If you find any kind of oil or grime on either fork seal, it's a good time to replace both of them. We're going to check the thickness of our brake pads and make sure they're within the limits. Depending on the caliper you have, you can visually inspect through either the top of the caliper or looking through the front to underneath the caliper. And what you're going to be looking for is the pad thickness. Here are two brake pads. These are both on the extreme ends of good and bad. This is a brand new brake pad with the full meat on there. This is an excessively used brake pad. You can tell it's very thin. If you find that you got something that looks like this in your caliper, it's a good time to change over. The last things we're going to check on our brake systems are the lines and fittings. We want to make sure that everything is tight and there's no leaks in either the fittings or the lines. If you do find any leaks or moisture around anything, you need to address those as soon as possible. Also check your line and fitting at your master cylinder, looking for leaks, cuts, abrasions, or kinks. Your rear master cylinder is located right beneath and behind your transmission. This is it right here. Make sure you check that line and fitting. Again, looking for any seepage, grime, or wetness. And same goes for your rear caliper. The last thing we're going to talk about when it comes to brakes is the fluid level. This applies to both the front and the rear master cylinder. You want to make sure you have the right level of brake fluid in here. And also you want to make sure you use the right brake fluid, whether it's a .3, a .4, or a .5. If you're not sure, check the cap of your master cylinder, or even better yet, check your service manual. The last thing we're going to check on the front end is critical fasteners, such as axle, pinch bolts, caliper bolts, even these fender bolts. All these things are very important to make sure that they're tight and or torqued to proper torque specs. And your triple tree pinch bolts and riser bolts. And lastly, the top clamp bolts, as well as your hand control bolts for bolt size. Next thing you want to check is your throttle free play. This seems pretty good. If you have excessive free play before any throttle actuation, you're going to need to go ahead and adjust your throttle cables. Whether you have a single or a dual cable, they're adjusted right here under this protective rubber, and you can find the proper methods and procedures in your service manual. And don't forget about the clutch. You want about the thickness of a nickel free play in this cable. If you have excess amount or not enough, you need to adjust your clutch. Now we're going to talk about the exhaust. We want to make sure that not only are we not leaking any exhaust fluids past the heads and the pipes, but we also want to make sure that these exhaust nuts are tight. I've seen many times where you lose one nut and then you develop an exhaust leak and your bike runs like shit. I want to show you a tool that I like to use when I tighten exhaust nuts. This is a quarter drive with a 1/2 inch 12-point wobble head. This makes it super easy to get to those exhaust nuts and tighten them. The last thing we're going to check when it comes to exhaust on a Dyna is the rear exhaust mount. Now, this engine is rubber mounted, so the pipe moves with the engine. I have seen personally exhaust mounts on Dynas crack right over here. Now, that depends on the manufacturer and the materials used. So always keep an eye on your bracket. Watch the weld, watch the mounts, and tighten these, keep these bolts tightened. Now we're going to address our air cleaner, whether it's on a carburetor or EFI, same thing. If your air cleaner is black and grimy and wet from oil, it's a good time to either replace it or clean it. A restricted air cleaner is going to definitely affect how your motor runs and performs. So make sure this thing is clean. Obviously, this one you can see is nice and white. It is clean. It's good to go. Another thing is your breather bolts. Sometimes you're going to feel lots of oil. Let's see how this one is. You can see a little bit of oil there. Now, the way this twin cam engine works is it breathes through the heads, through into the filter, back into the carburetor. It's a closed system. But sometimes these O-rings or plastic washers that they use for gaskets, they deteriorate over time and you'll get a little bit of oil leak past that. So if you find a little bit or excessive oil around your breather area, it might be a good idea to go ahead and replace those components to get it nice and sealed. And the last thing to check on your fuel system is your fuel line. You want to make sure that it is in good condition, that there's no cracks, kinks, or leaks. Another commonly neglected part on a bike are the spark plugs. This bike is 19 years old. Sometimes you'll find a bike that has the original spark plugs in them. Now, if the bike runs fine, great. But with a new spark plug, it will probably run even better. Next thing we're going to talk about is foot controls. Whether the bike is new or used, you may or may not like where the foot controls are set up. Don't worry, it's easily adjustable if you need it. You can see here on Josh's bike, his shift lever is a little low for my likings. I really have to reach down with my toe to get under there. So what I would do to remedy this, if this were my bike, is to adjust this shift lever up. The way you do that, whether it's an aftermarket shift lever or a stock shift lever, is you remove the pinch bolt, slide the shift lever off the spline shaft, rotate it to where you like, whether it's up or down, insert it back on the spline shaft, and tighten that bolt. Just like Josh's shift lever, his rear brake lever takes a little bit more effort than I'm used to actuate. Not a big deal. If this was my bike, I would just adjust this brake lever up. I'm going to show you how to do that now. So if you find that you want to adjust your rear brake pedal, it's really simple. All you got to do is break loose this jam nut and then adjust the rod in or out, which makes it go up or down with this second squared nut. Once you find the height of the brake pedal that you like, go ahead and tighten your jam nut back against the square nut. Let's talk real quick about your battery. Take the time to remove your seat to access those two bolts on the back of your battery that holds the positive and the negative cable. Just make sure they're tight. Check those. Before we move to talking about the rear half of the bike, once again, check your critical fasteners. Peg mount, motor mounts, even something as simple as your gas tank mounts. Check all that stuff, make sure it's tight. You don't want anything falling off as you're going down the road. Just like everything else on your bike, check the fasteners of the shocks, make sure everything's tight and to spec. But another thing you want to check is to make sure you're not leaking any fluid out of your shock body. If you are, that's something you're going to want to address. There's two ways to tell if you are. Obviously, a lot of fluid, or a really bouncy ride and your fluid may already all be gone. If you find either of those two, please address those issues as soon as possible. Whether you have a chain or a belt for your final drive, it's very important to make sure that everything is within spec and properly adjusted. Josh has a belt on his final drive, so what we're looking for here are frays along either side of the belt, as well as chips, gouges, or nicks on the teeth. Now, you want to have the wheel off the ground and rotate the rear wheel to check the whole belt. If everything checks out, next thing you're going to want to do is check for adjustment. Now, Josh's belt is definitely out of adjustment. I can tell just by feeling this. So if you find that your belt is too loose or too tight, you need to go ahead and adjust that properly. And you can find all that information in your service manual. It's also a good idea while you're checking your chain or belt adjustment, put some eyes and even a wrench on your sprocket bolts. Make sure they're all tight. If one of these backs out and catches your swing arm, that could be catastrophe. So check, make sure everything's tight. If you do find a loose one, take it all the way out, put a little red Loctite on there and put it back in. And if you do find a loose one, take them all out and reinstall them. Whether your rear belt needed to be adjusted or not, it's always a good idea to make sure that your rear axle nut is properly torqued, as well as having a pin clip, cotter pin, or spring clip in there. Now, this is a pin clip, this is a cotter pin, and this is a spring clip. No matter which one you use, make sure you have something in there. The last thing we're going to talk about today is checking the fluids on your motorbike. To check the oil, all you got to do is pop this dipstick. To check the transmission, put the appropriate sized Allen head and unscrew this dipstick. And to check the primary, all you got to do is remove this derby cover and make sure the fluid is at the proper level. So that's your basic Dyna checklist. Whether it's new to you or it's been sitting in a garage for 6 months, follow these simple steps we just outlined to ensure your bike is running and ready. And if you have any questions on procedures, techniques, torque specs, or fluid capacities, check your service manual.